Hi, class. Here's the next lesson on the French Revolution. If you haven't seen the other lessons or haven't watched a few of them, you need to go back, make sure you look at those. It's important. So, this lesson is going to be on the civil constitution of the clergy. And the civil constitution of the clergy was an attempt to reform the early church, the French Catholic Church in the early years of the French Revolution. So, let's review real quick. When we look back at the old regime was the French society before the revolution. We have the French divided in three parts. The first estate being the church, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate, which was everyone else. Now you can see that the first and second estates here in this picture are riding the third estate. And the French Revolution is partly about getting these guys off the third estate. But as the revolution becomes more radical, it's going to be more about the third estate doing a little bit more than that to the other two. Now, keep in mind, the civil constitution of the clergy is part of an overall effort to bring the privileged estates into this new French nation. Remember, the decrees of August 4th, which we've already discussed, these abolished the privileges of the nobility, got rid of their feudal dues, nobles' hunting rights, tax exemptions. All of that stuff was gone. Now, that was a very liberal reform aimed at taking away special privileges that were given to only one group of people. Now, it's basically they're kind of saying, now it's time for you, clergy. All right, now it's time for to bring you down to size. We already took care of the nobility, got rid of their privileges in 1789, and now you're next, clergy. So first of all, in 1789, the National Assembly confiscated church property, and in 1790, they abolished religious orders, nuns, monks, all of that kind of stuff. And the National Assembly abolished mandatory tithes. So if people were going to tithe, and tithe is, if you aren't aware, it's when you give money, right, to the church. So the National Assembly abolished mandatory tithes. So if people were going to tithe from here on out, they were going to do it because they wanted to voluntarily. No longer is the government going to collect tithes. So the church is now at the mercy of the state. The church no longer has land. They no longer have these mandatory tithes or other privileges. So the civil constitution of the clergy is next. And the point of the civil constitution of the clergy is to transform this French Catholic Church into a civil religion, a state religion, not a religion that has privileges from the state, but a religion that functions as part of the state. And there are several key ingredients in this civil constitution. And first of all is the election of bishops and priests. Now, before this happened, you had to be some sort of noble to be a bishop. And the bishop was not accountable to the people. So now the priests and the bishops will be elected democratically. Then, once they're elected, they have to swear an oath of allegiance to the state to make sure that they are going to be loyal to France before they are going to be loyal to the Pope. There are going to be standard pay scales. The bishops are going to make this much. This is predetermined. The bishops are going to make this much. A priest will make this much. Depending on how big his congregation is, and so on and so forth. So they're going to be paid based on a standard pay scale. There's going to be an attendance policy. We're going to make sure that everyone's here, right, when it's time for church and all that kind of stuff. And bishops and priests have to get permission to travel outside of their diocese, outside of their general area. Now, what abuses did this seek to curb? So let's review these regulations real quick. So the election of bishops and priests was designed to bring the bishops and the priests in line with the people, rather than these titles being handed out based on who they knew that was connected to the church, right? And the oath of allegiance was to try to make sure these people are loyal first and foremost to the French nation. The pay scales, we can assume that bishops and priests had been overpaid under the old regime, and so they were going to change that. And finally, we can assume that often these priests and bishops were absent. So that is why the attendance policy was implemented. So all of these abuses are being remedied, they're being addressed, or they're trying to fix them. And there's an attempt to remedy these abuses in the civil constitution of the clergy. Now, we have to ask, though, how liberal was this? Okay, keep in mind we're talking about classical European liberalism. The French Revolution at first was seeking liberal reform, and by that I mean they were seeking less of a role for the government to create a more free, less regulated state. Now, although the civil constitution of the clergy is reforming the church in France, to the extent that it was liberal is up for debate. Because when you think about this, the church is accountable to the state rather than separate from the state, as a classical liberal would want it. So, really, the civil constitution of the clergy forms a bit of a bridge between the liberal revolution of 1789 and the more radical revolution of 1793 and 1794. So we see some liberal elements that they're trying to take away. Privileges, they're trying to take away privileges. That's like a liberal belief and action to take. But then the regulations that are put on the church are not liberal at all. Regulation, remember, and so instead of trying to liberate the church by separating it from the state, the National Assembly chose to regulate the church by placing it under state control. Now, among the French clergy, there are two groups. These two groups are, first of all, the swearing priests, and second, the refractory priests. Now, who are these people, right? The swearing priests are these are the guys that were totally on board with the civil constitution of the clergy. They're very excited, so excited, we just can't even say what they were really thinking, right? Probably wasn't appropriate, but they're totally cool with this stuff. These swearing priests, they had no problem swearing an oath of allegiance, obviously. So see what I did there? They were for swearing, right? Now, then there are the refractory priests, and these are the guys who are not so crazy about this civil constitution. These are the more conservative priests, and the priests that do not believe that they should have to take an oath of office. They are the ones who truly believe some of what we would describe as liberal, who believe that the church should be separate from the state. So those are the refractory priests. Now, refractory is a word that means stubborn or unmanageable. That's what that word means. So the Google definition mentioned something when I looked it up. Mentioned someone's refractory pony. Okay, so if a pony is not behaving himself or herself, that pony is called refractory. Now, as you can see, there is some regionalism here. Some regionalism in the French Revolution. We can look at this map and we can see the percentage of swearing priests differs depending on where you are. So if we look here closer to Paris, right, which is up in this region of France, we see that over 83% of the priests were swearing oaths of allegiance. Then if we look in southeastern France, it's the same way down here. But the farther you get away from Paris, right, and if you look more in southern France, if you look in northeastern France over here, and if you look in northwestern France, you can see that there are areas where less than half of the priests were swearing oaths of allegiance. So there were more refractory priests located in those regions. So keep in mind that the French Revolution is something that's stronger in some places than others. This civil constitution of the clergy was heavily resisted by members of the clergy in these regions. So here is a cartoon that is from the point of view of someone who supports the civil constitution of the clergy. This is the procession of refractory clergy, showing these refractory clergy with long noses, as you can see here. And this is actually an anti-Semitic gesture, making them out to look like Jews who are seen as being outside of the French nation. So keep in mind that anti-Semitism appears throughout European history and didn't originate just with Hitler, okay? And here is another cartoon drawn by people who are sympathetic to the civil constitution of the clergy. That means they support it and other similar reforms. So in this cartoon, we see the nuns and the monks all running around celebrating, marrying each other, and all that kind of stuff. Now, you could think of this as freedom, but at the same time, you could also think about this as chaos because the French Revolution is starting to radicalize. These reforms are going from the modest reforms sought by the Estates General that we've talked about to some more radical reforms. So keep in mind that the civil constitution of the clergy builds that bridge between the liberal revolution of 1789 and the radical revolution of 1793 and 94. We see a foreshadowing of the radicalism that is to come. And eventually, during the reign of terror, we are going to see not just the regulation of the church, but an attack on the church. And as you can see in this picture of a nun who is stripping herself of her vestments, this is kind of a graphic photo. And this is attacking the church. This is saying here, the caption is, "And we too shall be mothers because." That's what the caption says. So it basically means we are not going to be part of the church anymore. We are forsaking the church. So keep in mind that sometimes the regulation of something can eventually lead to the attack on something. That the French Revolution starts off as liberal and then gets into regulating things and then spins out of control, as you can see in the picture of the storming of the Bastille. And it starts to turn towards attacking these institutions like the French Catholic Church that had been key institutions under the old regime. And this is what's going to result in criticism from people like Edmund Burke, who I will talk about in an upcoming lesson. And really that wraps us up on the civil constitution of the clergy. So hopefully you learned something. Let me know if you're confused about anything, and I will do my best to help you. So keep watching these videos, okay?